Okay,
Who's recording?
I'm recording. I'm recording myself.
Oh,
I like to to listen to myself.
then
So
you go home and listen to you.
exactly.
Okay,
Is there a pen?
there's nothing wrong with your ego.
We're actually going to talk about that. Okay, so welcome to the Kabalah of Matzah. I'd like to start off with the joke.
Oh, all right.
Nothing to do with matzah, but it has to do with Passover. So there's a man named Abe, and Abe goes to his boss and he says, "Listen, my wife really needs help cleaning for Passover. Could you let me up? Could you let me off for a day?" And the boss says, "Listen, I'm sorry, Abe, but we really need you here, and we have work to get done." And Abe tries again. He says he tries, different tactics. He tries to convince his boss, and his boss wasn't budging. He says, "No, we need you. You can't take any days off. We need you. We need you to come in every day." So finally, Abe says, "Thank you, boss. I knew I could count on you."
That's funny.
Well, I don't know if I told you, but I was gonna go to Italy this week to get the brand new Italian matzah. Called
Oh.
mozzarella.
What is the Italian mafia?
Mozzarella.
Oh, for pity's sake.
Okay, so let's learn about the Kabalah of Matzah. So the way this class is structured, so we're going to learn three different kind of requirements for that make the matzah kosher for the Seder, and then we're going to learn the Kabalistic or the spiritual meaning behind each one of those. So the way I'm gonna split it up is like this. We're gonna first learn one of these laws, then the Kabbalistic behind it, and then we'll do the other two together.
So there's different meanings behind.
Different messages. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
That'd be good.
So the first one I want to start with, and let's just take a minute to learn about what exactly matzah means. What is matzah? So literally, matzah means something which is kind of unfinished, which is not fully processed. It's actually a word which is not only used regarding food. It's used just recently. We were learning the laws of how to make tefillin, and of course it's made out of leather, so the leather has to be processed, and there's different stages. And there's a law that if you use leather which is not fully processed, then it's not kosher and it's not good for the tefillin. The term that's used is matzah. If you use the leather, that was matzah.
Oh.
So matzah means something which is not fully, not fully processed, and that's the matzah. The matzah that we eat on Passover is, again, it's bread, which is not fully it's not bread the way it should be. It's kind of didn't follow through the full process.
So if you're making a dish and it's not completely done, you would say, "I want to taste that." No, it's still matzah.
I guess you might be able to say that. I'm not sure exactly how it's used, but I guess you could say that. So that's what matzah means. Now the opposite of matzah is what we call chametz. Now chametz means something which literally means to ferment.
Okay.
Ferments. The word for vinegar in Hebrew is chometz. So chametz means any time you have grain which had this kind of chemical reaction that it starts to ferment, or I don't know exactly what it's called in scientific terminology, but it kind of ferments, and when you make sourdough, right? So you take flour and then it ferments.
Yeah.
And that's what chametz is. Chametz is grains that fermented, that became, they started becoming sour, they fermented, and of course, what we know what happens when grain ferments is that it begins to rise. And it's many different stages. It could take a long time. Yeah.
When you have kosher wine for Passover, it still ferments, though, right?
Right. Again, because it's not grain. So only chametz is only, at least the prohibition of chametz on Passover is only grains.
Okay.
Which fermented. Okay, so I have it on my notes. So the next thing I wanted to say is exactly, I wanted to point this out. There's only 5 grains that, the way the Torah understands, that only 5 grains actually have this chemical process, and they ferment in this way. And the 5 grains are wheat, which I think is the most commonly used in bread, and then barley, oats, spelt, and rye. So those 5 grains are the grains that ferment. Any other grain or any other kind of ingredient, today there's many different kinds of breads, especially if you're gluten-free or
Yeah,
low carb or whatever. There's all kinds of people make bread out of, I don't know, rice. What do people use?
Lentils now.
Oh,
That's a
really?
popular one.
Ezekiel bread, right? That's
Ezekiel-
sprouted.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but nuts and seeds.
Nuts, okay.
And, yeah, I'm trying to think what else. Chia seeds are popular
Okay.
now. I've seen a lot of pictures of people making chia cakes and chia breads.
Right, so there's many different ways, and especially now we're getting more and more creative. There's many ways to make flour and make technically bread, but it doesn't have, at least from a Torah perspective, I don't know scientifically, I don't know exactly how this works. From a Torah perspective, only these 5 grains that we mentioned actually have this fermenting process.
Okay.
Everything else doesn't ferment in the same way. It might rise a little bit, but it's not the same. It's a different kind of thing.
It's wheat, barley, and what else?
spelt,
What?
wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye.
But once it's been cooked, such as into matzah, you can
Right.
make whatever you want with it because now it's not allowed to ferment because it's already been
Right,
cooked.
yeah, once it's cooked, it doesn't ferment
Once
anymore.
dead,
Yeah.
it's fine.
Yeah, so there's different stages of how quickly things ferment. When you, like I mentioned before, sourdough, in order to make your starter for your sourdough, it takes like a week. I mean, at least even the first, like I think throughout the week you're just feeding it, but even you don't even feed it for the first day or
You can
two.
make foolish.
What's
Only
that?
takes 24 hours. Foolish is similar to sourdough, but so you just don't add the salt. You just add a little bit of yeast and a little bit of sweetener and your flour and your water. You let it sit for an hour. You can see that it rises all the way to the top of the bowl, depending on, how much you make.
Right.
Put in your fridge, you can put in overnight, but it's already leavened. You can actually see the leavening process. And it makes your dough have that sour taste without feeding it for a week.
Right.
So you can look up foolish and
Okay, that's interesting. We'll try it out.
and there are recipes for challah with foolish.
Okay.
Supposed to be a healthier way to eat your bread, just like sourdough.
All right, so yeast, today everyone uses yeast. Yeast makes the process happen very quickly. So you put in your flour and your water, and then you put in your yeast, and within an hour, it's risen, and you pretty much, I mean, there's probably different ways, but generally you give it an hour, that's enough. But even without an hour, even without yeast, just mixing flour and water will eventually cause things to rise and ferment. It will take a long time. It might take, I don't know, a day or many hours, but the fermenting process happens very quickly. The beginning happens very quickly. So from, halachically, within 18 minutes, it already starts to ferment. So matzah, to make sure it's totally not chametz, that it's totally not fermented at all, it has to be baked within 18 minutes
After water.
after the water touches it.
So it doesn't ferment.
It doesn't ferment at all.
I saw a video on that. It was so cool watching the baker make.
So do you have
Yeah.
special ovens that make it bake at a high temperature? Is that what-
Yeah, they bake it at, I don't know, 1500 degrees or more.
Wow.
Very hot ovens. And actually the baker, can imagine, he has to be like in the oven, very high temperatures. It's a very tough job.
So matzah, the square stuff, it's not as burned. So are they baking it at a lower temperature?
Very possibly.
So that if you have a place that serves bread before Passover, can you kosher your oven to make matzah? And how do you do that? You have to just.
You could, yeah, you just have to clean it very well and basically
it in.
burn everything off.
Okay, because someone said you can use a pizza oven to make matzah. That runs at
Technically.
a high temperature.
Yeah.
Okay.
It has to be a high temperature.
Yeah, very high.
Okay, so that's kind of like the introduction. So let's actually look at our sources. And so we're going to read number 1 and number 2, which are different verses, which, straight out of the Torah. The Torah tells us not to eat chametz and to eat matzah.
You should not eat
Okay.
leaven.
Let's start with number 1.
Moses said to the people, remember this day when
Yeah.
you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for with a mighty hand the Lord took you out of here and therefore no leaven shall be eaten.
Okay, so no leaven. No leaven means anything which, as we described, anything which ferments, any one of these 5 grains which ferments should not be eaten. That's okay. Forgot your name, but number 2.
Rebecca,
Yeah, Rebecca. Okay.
You shall not eat leaven with it. For several days you shall eat with it matzah, the bread of affliction, for in haste you went out to the land of Egypt, so that you shall remember the day when you went out of the land of Egypt all the days of your life.
Okay.
I like that.
So there we have both concepts are mentioned actually in this verse. It says not to eat leaven, but then it says you should eat matzah. I just want to point out it says with it. The verse says twice with it. That's just because of the context. It's referring to the Paschal sacrifice.
Oh,
Okay.
So I didn't give the full context, but that's with it is referring to the Paschal sacrifice.
So I have a question on this haste issue.
Okay.
I have a problem with the way Passover food is baked. I was telling you earlier. When you bake a regular cake, it takes 35 to 40 minutes
You're saying in the oven?
in the oven.
Okay.
When you make a sponge cake, which is kosher for Passover, it takes an hour.
Really?
Tell me, if we're supposed to be baking in haste, why are we doing this? And the other thing is you really want the cake to rise up. So you use all those eggs, the egg whites, you whip it up, and it's rising. This is, to me, the meaning of Passover is lost when you're making things rise and get all fluffy. We're not eating just flat stuff that we hastily make. We've made it so it's ridiculous. Lee cooks his matzo balls for half a day just to make them fluffy. I mean, like, this is like insane, the stuff we do, and it loses that idea.
Okay.
But it tastes better.
So if you want to give any insight or just listen to my rant, that's fine.
So we're actually going to talk. We're going to talk later. We're going to talk about the haste. We're going to talk about the spiritual meaning of the haste.
Okay.
So for now, I'm sorry about the way I set up the sheet, the order. So we're going to skip to number 5. And by the way, do you guys like the design on the sides of the border?
That's when you're running out of ink.
So yeah, I'm actually running low on toner, but it actually looks nice.
I thought it looked like matzah.
So number 5,
it's the best.
we're going to read number 5. This is straight out of the Zohar, and this is a big, I guess a very big thing to, one of the first things you're going to read when you want to learn about the spiritual meaning of matzah is this Zohar.
okay, want me to read it?
Yeah, sure.
A king had an only son who fell seriously ill. After a time, the prince expressed a desire to eat, but he was forbidden to eat any food other than that prescribed by the physicians. And orders were given that for the set term of that diet, no other viands should be found in the palace. All was carried out accordingly. But when the prince came to the end of the period of his special diet, the ban was lifted. And it was intimidated that now he was free to eat whatever he fancied, since it would not harm him. Similarly, when the Israelites came out from Egypt, they knew not the essence and the mystery of the faith. Said the Holy One, let them taste only the medicinal food, and before they have finished it, be shown no other food soever. But when the matzah were finished, which was the medicine by means of which they were to enter and to comprehend the mystery of the faith, then the Holy One proclaimed, from now on they may see and eat leavened bread, because it cannot harm them, especially on the day of Shavuos, when the supernal bread, which is a cure of all ills, was prepared for them.
Okay. Sorry about the translation. The translation is a little bit funny. I don't know where I got it from, but so there's a lot to talk about in the Zohar. So first thing I want to point out is that the Zohar is comparing the matzah to like a medicine.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, it's the term that the Zohar uses in in the Aramaic is michla de asvasa, which means the food of healing. Matzah is the food of healing. So as we're going to learn about that, it primarily refers to spiritual healing, and we're going to explain soon. But there was also the idea of physical healing. The Rebbe many times would tell people who are dealing with health issues, he would tell them to make sure to eat matzah. He would give them matzah to eat. In fact, there was the Rebbe had it was kind of like a doctor. He had a certain doctor that he would send whenever he wanted to do like a supernatural healing, or he wanted to give someone a special blessing for healing that wasn't necessarily through the regular natural way of healing. So he would send them to this doctor. So many times he would give special matzah. Passover time, we give matzah to this doctor. So matzah is connected with, as we're going to see soon, it's connected with spiritual healing, but it is also connected with physical healing. So that's one thing I wanted to point out.
Which is really funny, because most people complain they get health problems when they're eating matzah.
Okay.
It doesn't cleanse them that way.
It's not the easiest to digest.
That's another good way to say it.
That's why prunes were created. God created the prune.
Basically, a form.
But I want to talk about what the Zohar was primarily referring to spiritual healing. So how does matzah give us a spiritual healing? So for this, I want to go back to a Hasidic discourse from the first Chabad Rebbe, the one who wrote the Tanya, Rabbi Shneur Zalman. So he wrote many other Hasidic works. So in one of his other works, he writes about this. He writes about the matzah, and he explains how every mitzvah that we do, besides for, of course, being a way to connect to God, it's a commandment that God gave us, and it's a way to connect. Every mitzvah has a specific kind of spiritual effect. Every mitzvah has its own thing. One mitzvah is good for your mind. There's one mitzvah is good for this, for that. So matzah is good for your faith.
And you're going to tell us why? Or are we going to guess?
Yes. So let's explain. So what's the difference between chametz and matzah? So one of the differences, you spoke about the fermentation, but because of that, the chametz rises. Dough that is fermenting starts to rise. Whereas matzah, it doesn't ferment, so it hasn't risen yet. It just stays exactly as it was.
The scent is not.
Scent, okay.
Oh my gosh. The scent of freshly baked bread must be so much better than freshly baked matzah, because that fermentation creates such a nice smell in your house and your oven.
He knows because his wife makes challah and all the other stuff every week, right?
Yeah, I make some of them too. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. I've tasted it. It's the best in the world.
So spiritually, this is the difference between ego or not ego. So someone mentioned before ego. So matzah, something that rises is kind of like the ego. It's
puffed up.
It's puffed up, and it continues to puff up and more and more and more, and until it just takes up everything. And what happens is, sometimes when we have too much ego, we forget about God. It kind of gets pushed out of the picture.
What, Hamas? Puffs up?
And so every person has, everyone has their inner ego,
right,
which is natural. And if it pops up too much, it's not healthy.
It becomes pride or something, an unhealthy form of pride.
It becomes center stage, and then it begins to take up more and more of the stage until there's nothing left for anyone else.
Also, it takes up all the room you would have for Hashem.
Exactly. So matzah means it's not rising. It's very basic. It leaves a lot of room for God, for a lot of room to be aware of the bigger things in life, to be aware of God and what God wants from me. What does He put me in this world for? So that is the kind of that's
So
that's the idea of a matzah.
Oh, I get like when they were leaving Egypt, they were leaving a place of great spiritual corruption.
Right.
And so they were eating matzah, preparing, making room because they were going to become united to Hashem.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that also, how it connects to the story of the Exodus. So again, so the Alter Rebbe, as he's known, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, is explaining that just as in the physical sense, matzah is bread that hasn't risen. So also spiritually, when you eat matzah, at least when you do it as the mitzvah of matzah, if you eat the matzah during the Seder, the night of the Seder, so it has that similar spiritual effect on us. It gives us this effect. It kind of nourishes this kind of awareness of God.
It doesn't make you as happy as eating, like, let's say, I'm thinking, if they were really in a rush, I would have made it like pizza, or naan bread, and stuck it on a stove top, slap, you go, it's soft, you can roll it up, you do all kinds of things. That would make me happier than eating a crispy dry cracker.
So it's interesting that matzah doesn't necessarily have to be crunchy or crispy. It could be soft.
But it's not.
So nowadays, it's not the way it's produced, and because it's just less practical.
But do you think
because it's commercial? It definitely was soft back in the day. Was I'm not sure when, but at certain points, matzah baking became more commercial, and it needs more shelf life. Exactly. But the idea of rising, right? It could either be soft or hard, but both of them don't have to rise. It could still be matzah. So again, this is the spiritual, just like in the physical, you have the matzah, which doesn't rise. So spiritually, the spiritual phenomena of eating matzah, of doing this mitzvah, has a similar effect. It has the effect of kind of quashing down our ego and instead making us aware,
Humbling.
kind of humbling, and also making us aware of God.
Yeah.
It strengthens our faith. So as mentioned, the Zohar calls it the food of healing.
The food of healing, I love that.
Because it takes away this, it kind of quashes this ego, which is unhealthy for us spiritually. But it's also called the bread of faith for the same reason. Also, we're going to talk about that in the next part.
I'm sorry, I'm so negative. I'm sorry.
So this is the first idea that I wanted to bring out, is that when we eat the matzah, of course, it's you get a nice crunch. You have your moment to eat that matzah, but we could take a moment and think about becoming aware. What this impact has, what this matzah is doing for our spiritual self. What's it doing for our soul? It's food for the soul. It's strengthening our belief. And this is something which you don't have the rest of the year. There's no other food that you could eat the rest of the year. If you eat matzah today,
That's right.
it's not going to have that spiritual effect. It's only if you eat the matzah as when the mitzvah is, when the mitzvah to eat matzah is at the Seder.
And how long are you supposed to avoid matzah if you were a person to consume it throughout the year, which I do not, because I find it's non-addictive and not very interesting. So I save it just for Passover.
Right. I also.
Aren't you supposed to refrain a week before from
So-
if you were to eat matzah like this?
So the day before Passover, it's very strict prohibition. You should not eat matzah. But then also it's not as strict, but a full month before. So starting from Purim, the day of Purim is exactly a month before Passover. Starting from then, we shouldn't eat matzah.
No matzah sandwiches.
Someone was telling me that some people had old matzah left over from last year, and they were saying maybe it's still good, maybe taste it. But then we realized it's within 30 days. We can't just have to throw it out.
Yeah, or taste it during Passover.
Right. We just hope that it's still good.
And it is.
Right. It usually is.
Or you can use it for a door jam, keep the door.
That's little kids, that's good.
Okay. So now I want to cover, that was kind of part one. So we covered one of the kind of requirements, the halachic requirements of the matzah, and then we showed what the Kabalistic meaning of that is. So we spoke about how matzah on the simple level, matzah is something which doesn't rise, and the spiritual meaning of that is something which the spiritual effect that the matzah has when we eat it is also it makes us less rising. It quashes down the rising and instead makes us aware of it gives us that faith. It gives us the awareness of God. So next part, I want to talk about two. We're going to kind of fuse two things together. So we're going to talk about two different other requirements that are important for the matzah of the Seder. So we're gonna read text 3 in a second. And it's very funny for those of us who were at the Talmud course. A lot of these points we mentioned along that course because we spoke about Passover. So a lot of these things are coming up again. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe not. I don't know. But so generally matzah is made out of wheat, right? And I think nowadays most breads are made out of wheat. But what if you want to make it out of something else? Could you make rice matzah?
Yeah.
No.
Well,
So you definitely could make it. It's possible to make it, right?
Really?
You could, yeah, you take the dry rice kernels, you grind them up, you make flour, but you could also buy the flour
well,
and then mix it with water, make a dough.
free matzah made out of commercially.
So I think it's made out of oats, and we'll see soon why.
And then,
Oh, yeah.
can you use tapioca on Passover?
I'm not sure what it is. A root?
The root, yeah.
So
Okay,
it's
so yeah.
kosher to use for Passover? Okay. Because tapioca starch is used a lot in gluten-free baking. They usually add tapioca flour.
So I've heard it. I just didn't know what it was. It's a starch of a root,
Like a potato, yeah.
right? Okay.
So the 5 grains you have listed there, wheat, barley, oats, spelt, rye, all of those could be kosher for making a matzah?
Right. So the question is, how do we know that? What by which base? I think we actually mentioned this piece of Talmud actually in the last course, but this is a good refresher. So how do we know which grains are good for matzah and which ones are not? So I mentioned before rice. I could make rice matzah. I don't know what it would taste like. It probably would taste different. But it would not be halachically, it would not be matzah, it would not be kosher for the Seder.
Because you don't eat rice. Ashkenazi Jews do not eat rice.
Right. So Ashkenazi Jews don't eat rice, but let's say I'm Sephardic. So I'm allowed to eat it, but it still would not be matzah, wouldn't be the mitzvah. If I would have rice matzahs at my Seder, I would not be doing the mitzvah of eating matzah.
And are you
So
doing
you
this?
can make the rice, but it's not kosher.
It's kosher, but it doesn't fulfill the special
Required.
commandment. Yeah.
Are you, so does gluten-free matzah fulfill the mitzvah? Because I
Yes.
don't know that the gluten-free is made from oats. I have not looked at the
So-
package. All I see is it's got tons of eggs in it. But other than that, I don't know.
So if it has eggs in it, so that's another reason why it wouldn't be good. So we'll see in the next piece that we'll learn. But oats is one of those five. So oats
Yeah.
by itself would be okay. So how do we know which grains are good for matzah and which grains are not good for matzah? So let's read number 3, straight out of the Talmud.
Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, and likewise a sage of the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, and likewise a sage of the school of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov taught that the verse states, you shall eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat with it matzah, the bread of affliction. This verse indicates that only with substances which will come to a state of leavening, a person fulfills his obligation to eat matzah with them, provided he prevents them from becoming leaven. This excludes these foods, i.e. rice, millet, and similar grains, which, even if flour is prepared from them, and water is added to their flour, do not come to a state of leavening, but to a state of decay. Rotten,
Yeah.
spoiling.
So apparently there is some sort of reaction, some sort of fermenting, similar to fermenting that happens with rice or millet or other things, but it's not the same. It's not considered fermenting. It's a different.
It becomes
Different.
moldy,
Is that what it is?
probably.
I mean, I'm sure wheat also becomes moldy. Apparently there's some sort of process that happens, but it's very different than the fermentation of wheat or of those things. So there's what the Talmud is based on over here. There's a concept, right? There's different ways that the sages have received, different ways that we read the verses, different methods that we use to pick up hints in the structure.
The 5 grains you have listed up there, is that those 5 grains listed in the Torah?
No.
So that's in the Talmud later on.
Yes.
Okay.
So one of these methods that the sages know that kind of they receive this tradition is one of the ways we look at the verse is that when one verse, or even if it's 2 verses next to each other, if they mention 2 different concepts kind of in the same sentence or in the same discussion, so there's some sort of connection there. We should connect them. We should learn from one to the other, some sort of connection. So here in this verse that we mentioned, it says you shall eat no leavened bread with it. And then in the same verse, it says 7 days you shall eat with it matzah. So there's a connection here between leavened bread, right, chametz, and matzah. They're both mentioned in the same verse in the same sentence. So what's the connection? What's the connection between the two? So this is exactly what the Talmud is telling us. In order for it to be matzah, it has to be something which could have become leavened.
Oh, so that's why it's written that way. Yeah, kind of
I was
doesn't.
wondering about that.
Yeah, kind of doesn't make a lot of sense.
What a tease. That is a real tease. You know, to me, like matzah is not a good thing because it's not salted, there's no sugar. It's like the most boring, hard food that you can imagine. I would rather have a baked potato plain than have a piece of matzah for lunch, like what would I reach for? So in some ways, it leaves room for God because you're praying the week will be over and you can go back to better bread.
Right. This actually leads us right into the next thing. So that was one kind of the second requirement for matzah. So number 1, we said matzah means it doesn't rise, it doesn't ferment. But number 2, it has to be from the type of grain that could have fermented. So as we mentioned, it's only those 5 grains of wheat, barley, oats, spelt, and rye. Anything else, rice, it will never ferment in the same way. So of course you're allowed to eat it, but it's not matzah. It wouldn't be fulfilling the mitzvah of eating matzah if you make it out of those. So it has to be the kind of grain that could have fermented. So now the third requirement for matzah is what we call, as you mentioned before, is the bread of affliction. Or another way to call it is the poor man's bread. Now, what does that mean? So the literal meaning of that is in number 4, again from the Talmud. It's actually the next page, the page after the one we just read in the Talmud. That's number 4.
What is the meaning? Rabbi Akiva says, what is the meaning when the verse states lechem ani, poor man's bread? The Baraita answers, this phrase excludes dough that was kneaded with wine, oil, or honey, which is not classified as poor man's bread, and therefore cannot be used for this mitzvah.
Yeah. So there's another requirement. If you want to have the matzah, at least the matzah for the Seder, that matzah should be totally plain. No other enrichments. Actually, the Hebrew word for it is called matzah ashira, which means rich, right? Kind of the opposite of poor man's bread, which is plain, is rich bread or enriched bread.
I buy not for the Seder, but for the week I buy a chocolate covered matzah.
Oh, come on. This year.
Yeah.
I actually went today. I brought someone matzah. I visited them in their house. He takes the matzah and it's like, oh, where's my chocolate covered matzah?
You take chocolate chips, put it on your matzah, and there's your chocolate covered matzah.
But that would actually not be considered enriched because it's added afterwards.
On top.
So the matzah itself could be plain, and then you add something else on top. That's okay.
But you can have that to fulfill your matzah
By the
requirement.
Seder, I'm not sure.
I don't think so, because when they make those chocolate covered matzah, they have to add an oil. Like typically you would add like coconut oil to make that chocolate hard, so it doesn't
Well,
stay
that's
soft.
something, yeah.
But is it in the dough or they add it on
No,
after?
they add it on after,
Right.
but I'm just saying, if you're gonna eat it in the same bite, it's like you're adulterating.
Yeah,
Right,
But we
right.
had, during the Seder, we had horseradish. We make that sandwich with horseradish and,
And,
Right.
and the
yeah.
romaine lettuce and the,
But that's
Kabalistic?
after you taste the plain matzah.
Right.
During the Seder, you're supposed to have a piece of the plain.
Right, yeah, there's
matzah.
2 steps. There's a
Hillel
step where we eat the
sandwich.
matzah and then we eat the Hillel sandwich after. Right. So yeah, so this is another concept, another requirement. Besides for the fact that the dough shouldn't rise, besides for the fact that it should be one of the 5 grains that could have risen, it also should be plain. No other, right? Any of these ingredients we mentioned, they all have kind of sugar. They all have some sort of extra taste. Sometimes, when you make, babkas or cakes or anything, you mix in juice or milk, or even milk has some sort of lactose. It's sweet, has some sort of extra taste. So the matzah for the mitzvah of the Seder has to be totally plain. So now I want to talk about the spiritual side of both of these mitzvahs, and they're kind of connected. That's why I'm lumping them together. So the difference between a poor man's matzah or a plain matzah or an enriched matzah is like you said, it's in the taste. If it's enriched, it tastes better. It's more enjoyable. It's tastier. Either it's with eggs or it's with chocolate or
Salt, sugar,
and
oil.
whatever it is. It's tastier. It's more enjoyable. It's not just plain. So if you want to talk about our spiritual life, we could have 2 kinds of matzahs. We could either be a plain matzah spiritually, or we could be enriched matzah. What's the difference? So imagine it's your first time in shul. The rabbi schlepped you over.
Yeah.
He said he needed a minyan or whatever it was. It's your first time, and it's your first time. You're not. Everything's new. You're maybe not so comfortable, not so familiar. Now, you have to be. You know that it's the right place to be. This is. I'm a Jew, and this is where I belong. This is the right place for me. But still, there's some sort of disconnect. It doesn't fully resonate yet. You need to go. You need to become acquainted. You need to become used to it. So that would be the plain matzah. That's the plain matzah. It's very plain. It's not enjoyable yet. You know that that you have to do it. You're eating it. It's the matzah, but it still doesn't resonate with you. It's not enjoyable. And of course, that's only stage 1. And of course, eventually we grow and we become an enriched matzah, and we start connecting, we start appreciating, we start enjoying whatever it is that we're doing in Judaism, in our connection with God. So for the Seder, we specifically eat not the enriched matzah, we eat the plain matzah. And we'll see soon why that's significant, and why that connects with the story of Passover.
Should you be eating a piece of plain matzah every day of Passover?
No, and there's a whole piece of Talmud which goes through that, and there's 3 different in the Torah. There's 3 different times that we're told to eat matzah, and each time it says that we should eat it for 7 days. But the way the sages learn all the verses, many different methods of how to read, how to actually read them properly, as the sages explain that the actual requirement to eat plain matzah is only by the Seder, the first night, or outside of Israel, it's the first 2 nights. And then the rest of Passover, it's only if you want to eat bread. If you want to eat something bread, then it has to be matzah. It shouldn't be dough that fermented. Or sponge cake.
If you're like being as religious as you're fine with eating sponge cake, right?
Technically speaking, I mean, Chabad custom is that we try not to eat anything that's made outside of our home.
Well,
But that's just a custom. Yeah, I could make it in my home, yeah.
And then it would be okay. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't buy it. I don't like buying
Right.
bakery stuff because I don't think it tastes as good. But try to emulate it and improve like you did.
Right,
Right away.
right.
Okay.
Yeah, so the actual, eating the poor man's bread is specifically the first night, even though the Torah doesn't say that. It doesn't seem to look like that if you just, from a plain reading of the Torah, it always says 7 days, but the actual mitzvah is only on the first day. So that's the first, that's the meaning of that law.
Mhm.
You know, spiritually we could be a plain matzah. We could be when we're just getting started and we don't fully connect, we don't fully resonate. Now moving on to the next law we mentioned, the law or the requirement that the matzah should be from I'm actually going out of order. But the law that the matzah should be from a kind of grain which could have become fermented, could have become chametz. So over here too, we kind of have in the spiritual world, we kind of have these two kinds of matzahs. You could have the matzah which will never ferment as hard as you try, and then you have the matzah which is on the verge of fermenting. It's about to rise. It's about, the ego is about to kick in, but it was quashed. It was stopped. Stopped in its tracks. So of course, our dream and our goal one day is to reach that level of matzah which will never rise, matzah which will never ferment, right? Get rid of that ego, and we won't have the possibility of ego, which of course could lead to all kinds of things. We want to have it fully in control.
Quick question, real quick question.
Okay.
I promise. So I looked up what gluten-free matzah is made of, and I know, like, medical reasons, there's always exceptions. Just saying, the common ingredients say tapioca starch, potato flour, and water. Then they add possibly oil, honey, egg yolks, vinegar, and salt. So
Okay.
they're not fulfilling the mitzvah.
But those are those square matzahs?
Yeah,
Okay, so there's another requirement which it's not part of what I prepared, but it's a very important requirement, is that the matzah for the mitzvah should be made with intention that it's going to be used for the mitzvah of the Seder.
oh,
Now-
that's why you get the shmura matzah?
That's why you get it handmade. Yeah,
Oh.
because the machine can't
Yeah.
have that intention. There's many mitzvahs actually like that. For example, the tzitzis, right? I'm wearing tzitzis here, or talis has tzitzis. The strings have to be made with intention that they're going to be used for the mitzvah of tzitzis. If it doesn't have that intention, they're not kosher. So there's many other mitzvahs which have to be made with intention. So matzahs is another.
So they can make it anyway, but your intention has to be good.
So it has to be made with specific purpose to be used for the mitzvah, for the commandment.
So do they make gluten-free matzah? for-
Right. So I was saying the handmade ones, they usually use oats. They're very expensive. I mean, even the regular handmade matzahs, they charge you, I don't know, whatever, it's like $20 a pound or $30 a pound. So the
Mhm.
oats are going to be $40, $50 a pound. My grandmother is gluten-free, so she gets, I mean, I think even oats are not fully gluten-free. I think they have a little gluten.
Depends on the processing, Like the one cereal, which is kosher, has the U on it, is Quaker Oats and the Cheerios.
Right.
So it's made from oats, and so that same oats, and it says gluten free on it. So you can take those oats and make matzah, I presume.
I guess.
Wow, that's interesting.
I
So-
know.
We're learning a lot about bacon.
$30 in stock at Lakeview, wherever that is.
Oh,
The shmura matzah made out of oats. You can buy it for $30.
Did you say earth?
No, it says Lakewood matzah.
Lakewood, New Jersey.
Is that where it is? Okay, you get 3 matzahs per box.
we should have had Yisrael pick it up on the way over here.
Oh, right.
Just made from oat flour and water only, vacuum packed for freshness.
Right.
You know anybody, and you got an extra $30, there you go.
I'm sure you could get it, locally in kosher
Probably.
stores.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are there any kosher bakeries in LA area for Passover? Are they all closed down?
Probably in LA, no?
Well, I don't know if they bring in from New York or they,
I've never heard of a kosher bakery for Passover that makes things fresh. I just never heard of it.
okay.
I think just practically, from the 8 days of Passover, 4 of them are holidays. So
Yeah.
you don't really have that much time to.
Yeah.
To
I'm
bake
just
things
wondering
fresh.
how- like macaroons, all the stuff that they get, so it has to be commercially made and. you
Yeah.
buy it. Okay.
Okay, so back to that. So the last law that we mentioned is that it has to be, matzah should be from the grain that could have became chametz, which means it's
The
it's
intent.
again the intent was a side was an important note, but it was a side note. So it has to be again. So within ourselves, it's that stage where we didn't fully our ego is not fully under control. It's not like we're totally safe and we're not worried that it's ever going to come back. We are we're still we're still we're still keeping our eyes open. We're still in that situation where our ego could still rise. It still could. Of course, we're controlling it. We're not letting it rise. It's not fermenting, but it could. And again, so it's kind of to the same concept we had before about the plain matzah. Again, the spirit. We're spiritually we don't fully appreciate yet what we're doing, and so that's the theme of Passover spiritually. That's the theme of at least of the matzah spiritually. It's kind of the beginning of our spiritual journey. We still don't fully appreciate everything, and we still have our egos, which are still on the loose, you could say. And that's the focus of matzah. And this really fits in with the theme of Passover, because if you go back to the story of Passover, right? Jewish people were in Egypt for hundreds of years, whatever it was, 210 years. Finally, they show up to Pharaoh and they say, Moses shows up and he says, please let the Jews go. We want to leave for 3 days. Let us out we want to go 3 days away. We'll do our festival. We'll offer offerings to God just for 3 days. Now, he never said that he's going to come back. He never said we'll come back, but he said for 3 days. So he kind of course, he wasn't planning to come back. So they kind of escaped. And the question is asked, why do they have to play this game? It doesn't seem like it had to be necessary, because Pharaoh wasn't going to let the Jewish people out even for 1 day. He wasn't ready to let them out at all. What forced him? He was forced because God did all these miracles and was ruining the whole country, sending frogs and death of the firstborn and all these 10 different plagues that we read about. So Pharaoh was forced to let the Jews out. So if we were forcing him to let them out for 3 days, we couldn't just force him to let them out forever. Like, he would have been forced either way. So why did Moses have to play this game and say, we just want to leave for 3 days and then not come back? What was that necessary? So again, going back to the Alter Rebbe, the one who wrote the Tanya. So in the Tanya, actually, I think it's chapter 31, he talks about this. And he says that the real reason why we had to play this trick was not a physical reason. Physically, it really wasn't necessary. Moses could have been clear. He could have been open and say, listen, we want to leave and we don't want to never come back. And it would have still worked. The reason why they played the game was because spiritually, the Jews were in a spiritual Egypt. They were, as Hannah mentioned before, they were stuck in this spiritual low. And leaving Egypt also meant to leave the spiritual low and to grow spiritually, to rise up. And the problem was that the Jews were so stuck that they weren't fully ready to leave. If the Jew would realize that right now we're going to leave Egypt, which means we're going to leave all of this, spiritual schmutz behind, and we're never going to look back at it, the Jew would not be ready to do that. It was just such a drastic change.
He was saying it to the Jews and not.
Exactly. The real reason why Moses was kind of playing this game was for the Jews. Of course, he said that to Pharaoh also because that's the way things work. Everything mirrors the spiritual.
But didn't he tell them to bring everything they had, all their livestock and all that?
He did, yeah. So it wasn't like it was a big secret. It was kind of clear. People kind of realized that they weren't going to come back. But there was this concept spiritually that we kind of had to trick ourselves into leaving. It wasn't because we were stuck. We weren't on that high level spiritually, and we weren't ready to just change our lives around. We weren't ready for that yet. It was too much. And so that's why we had to kind of play this trick, and we had to kind of escape. And it's also the idea of leaving in haste, right? We ran out, and as with the dough on our backs, we ran out quickly. So again, it's a reflection of the spiritual concept that we had to escape. We had to run away and get into that, kind of push ourselves into the spiritual growth, even though we might not fully be ready for it.
That's interesting.
And then Tanya goes on to explain this, this concept of, sometimes we might feel that we're not ready to, to grow spiritually, but we still gotta kind of ignore for a second, ignore what we may be feeling, and instead just focus on the positive, just do a mitzvah, even if we're kind of leaving and ignoring the kind of the schmutz of ourselves, but it doesn't change the fact that we also could be in a very good place at the same time. That's just where that's where the Tanya is going. But again, we see this concept that the focus of the story of the Exodus is exactly this. We're not talking about spiritual giants, and we're not talking about ourselves when we're after a lot of work and a lot of spiritual growth. We're talking about very basic minimum level, as we said, this reflects itself in the matzah. We have to eat the matzah, which is plain, we're not yet connecting with everything, and we still have that ego, which is still on the loose. It has to be able to rise, and that's the focus of the matzah. Yeah.
I have a question for you. Just thinking about this. So it seems like if you really want to grow spiritually during Passover, you can. Just don't try to have all the treats. Don't try to make matzah into lasagna. Don't try to make it taste so good that you absolutely love it. Instead, eat it for what it is and think about what it means between you and God. Don't try to make it taste like foods you really enjoy that aren't during Passover.
Right. That's exactly how I would put it. But this is only for the matzah during the Seder.
Right, I
The rest
understand, but I'm saying the whole week, we're celebrating, but we're also trying to remember. Is it really the point to really have like ridiculously rich, fattening foods during the whole week and be gluttonous when we're trying to be more spiritual and make room for God?
Right. Okay, absolutely. And technically speaking, I mean, you could apply this, all year round. After Passover also, why should we be gluttonous, and why should we be
It was like when the Lord God poured down manna out of heaven. They were learning humility. They were learning to accept. Of course,
right, to
they
trust
did
in God.
complain after a while, but it was an interesting lesson there in what that was, especially when you talked about the humility and
Right.
yeah. Wow.
So this is again a very powerful, for me, it's a very powerful message of the matzah.
Yeah,
Of the matzah. It represents our struggle. There's a value in our struggle. We're not talking about the high levels that we're talking about the very basic
low level.
the very basic levels and our struggles, and that's actually the mitzvah. The mitzvah is specifically that. That's what's valuable. Of course, Hasidic teachings talk about how God values so much our struggle. Sometimes we feel like we'll never get anywhere. We're never going to win. We're always going to be fighting. It's always we could spend a whole lifetime.
That's the battle we have.
And sometimes we feel like it's a waste of time. Like, why am I wasting my life? Like, I want to just win already. But we have this very big value of the struggle, and for God, it's very, very valuable. Very, I mean, it's hard for us. It may be very difficult sometimes, but for God really, really appreciates it. And this is really a story of the matzah, and this is a story of Passover in general. It says when Mashiach will come, right? And of course, everything will be good then. There won't be any more struggles. It says we're still going to remember, and we're still going to talk about the Exodus. We read about it actually during the Seder and the Haggadah. We mentioned this. We mentioned the concept that even when Mashiach will come, we're still going to talk about the Exodus. And the question is asked: why do we care about the Exodus? We have so much better now. We have the world is perfect. Why should we be talking about this kind of this Exodus? I mean, why is it so important? And maybe once in a while, maybe on Passover, you could mention it. But why there's actually a mitzvah to mention it, to remember it every single day? Why is it that important? And again, you see this value in the struggle. When Mashiach will come, we're not going to have the struggle, but at least we're going to have to remember about it. We're going to have to mention it. We're going to have to remember the story about it.
You read the whole story and you go, what a humbling It took 40 years and yet they still.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I think that's all I wanted to share for tonight. I'm sorry we didn't have any physical matzah.
But we're not supposed to eat it.
Exactly. So we had babka instead,
Good about that.
but don't eat it on Passover.
I can see like after the Seders and we're eating matzah for the whole week and we make ourselves a matzah sandwich. We're growing, so we're celebrating. It's not the first time we've been in shul. We're connecting more. Does that make sense?
So you're saying we go to shul several times over
Yeah.
Passover? Yeah, okay.
First, we get the plain matzah, and then as the week goes on, we start doctoring up that matzah a little bit, making matzah